Christmas is supposed to be a season of small certainties, the hum of a kettle, a neighbor's laugh, stockings hung with ritual care. But certainty can break like glass. On one winter night, a relationship that had existed mostly inside a phone and across glowing screens simply vanished. Not the person, the story itself unraveled. An online lover became a ghost. A woman's life, rearranged. And what people called Sweet Bobby was no longer a comfort, he became a question, an absence that refused to be explained. This is the story of how love online became a maze and how, one holiday season, the mask slipped. The night Sweet Bobby vanished is not simply about a missing man. It's a portrait of deception, of family secrets laid bare, and of the way truth can disappear inside a web of lies. Stay with me. The deeper you go, the harder it becomes to tell who vanished and who was hiding. To understand the vanish, you must first meet the people who thought they knew one another. The central figure in this story is Kirat, a young woman who trusted and loved in a way that many of us recognize, hungry for companionship, seeking a future, careful with her heart but hopeful. She is the person who, for years, was speaking to someone she believed to be Bobby. Her voice recorded in interviews, podcast episodes, and later on a Netflix documentary describes a relationship that felt real in all the ways that matter, intimate messages, shared hopes, and a promise of meeting. Her experience echoes with the modern truth that human connection now often begins on screens. Bobby Janda, the name in the messages, presented himself as a man with a stable life, a career, charm, and a family background that matched the cultural context of Kirat's own life. Over nearly a decade, messages, images, and staged crises bound them together, virtual promissory notes of a life that might be. For Kirat, the relationship was intimate, emotional, and in every sense real. But the truth hiding behind the persona of Bobby would later be revealed as something else entirely. On the other side of this digital romance was a fabrication, many fabrications spun together with painstaking detail. The person orchestrating it would create dozens of accounts and characters, a tangle so intricate that casual scrutiny missed it for years. People who later investigated the case described more than a simple impersonation, they described a long con, engineered with patience and cruelty. The eventual revelation that Bobby was an invented figure, forced the question that now sits at the center of the story: how do we label harm when the law hasn't caught up? This was a deception with real decline, lost time, emotional harm, reputational damage, and a courtroom that, in some ways, could not give the remedy that victims often deserve. As Kirat pursued the truth, she moved from private heartbreak to public advocate, and from confiding friend to plaintiff. To tell what happened on the night Bobby vanished, we must piece together years of messages, phone calls, false crises, and then follow the moment when the story collapsed and the man behind it vanished from the narrative entirely. We must be precise here: the crime is not a murder, not a physical abduction. The harm is emotional and psychological. It is the long, corrosive labor of making a person believe in a life that never existed. For Kirat, the deception was not a brief prank. It was a sustained invention that reached into the deepest parts of trust. Friends and listeners called it monstrous. The person lying wasn't a stranger, ultimately, she was a relative. When truth came, it reframed what had happened as a betrayal on a personal level as well as a legal one. Imagine receiving a text that says, "I'm at Heathrow, I can't wait." Imagine planning a life around someone who answers when you need them, who borrows sympathy to stage emergencies, who creates drama that summons your empathy and your loyalty. Imagine that those emergencies require favors, trust, and sometimes even money. Over time, lines blur. Is the relationship real because it feels real? Or is it purely an illusion? In Kirat's case, both were true: it felt real and it was a lie. That slow erosion, the little lies multiplied until they were a pattern, is what turned affection into something predatory. The impact on Kirat was not an immediate, dramatic theft. It was an accumulation: missed relationships, mental strain, a life spent trying to reconcile love with suspicion until she decided to find answers herself. The turning point, the night everything started to unravel, came not as a dramatic showdown on a snowy street but as a single discovery. Karat found the real man whose identity had been stolen. He was not her Bobby. He had never been part of the emotional life she had built around the name. He was unaware. That moment, meeting the real, unknowing man and seeing him call the deception what it was, marked the vanish of the persona. Bobby as an entity ceased to exist. The illusion was gone. But the harm persisted. What some call the crime here is layered: identity theft, emotional manipulation, and an erosion of trust so deep that the victim was forced into legal action to find accountability. Karat did not wait for the law to untangle what had happened. Motivated by a sense that she deserved answers, she hired a private investigator. Archive searches, digital footprints, and a patient mapping of social interactions began to show the shape of the operation. Profiles that had seemed unrelated started to connect. A photo here, a mutual friend there, a pattern of excuses and staged crises. Slowly, the map of deception was drawn. For investigative journalists and for the podcasters who later told Karat's story, the trail suggested a person who had incubated complex lies for years. The narrative revealed that the orchestrator had been able to build not one fake identity but dozens, sustaining a cast of characters that reinforced the illusion. That level of detail made it easier, eventually, to demonstrate intent and pattern. Karat's private investigator located the real Bobby, a man whose life had been co-opted on social media. He had no idea an online relationship was using his face and name. Meeting him was an X-ray of the deception. But legal recourse was not straightforward. In jurisdictions like the UK, the criminal code did not always neatly criminalize sophisticated catfishing. The police investigated, but criminal charges were not pursued in the way many expected. Instead, the path forward took the form of civil litigation. In 2020, Karat pursued a civil case. The court's language is different from that of a criminal court. The question is not, is this person guilty of a crime? But did they cause measurable harm that the law can recognize and remedy? In that suit, Karat succeeded. The defendant offered compensation and a private apology as part of a settlement. For many viewers, the result felt like justice by other means. But it was also a reminder: sometimes the law can only treat harm after the fact and the emotional cost remains. Local and national media reconstructed the timeline. Journalists, podcasters, and listeners began to pick apart motives, logistics, and the psychological anatomy of the catfisher. These public conversations were messy, often compassionate, and sometimes cruel. Some threads became hubs for collective puzzling, for anger, for speculation, for empathy. Users asked how a person could keep up dozens of fake profiles, and whether motives were personal, pathological, or something else. The community conversation amplified the case and brought the story to a global audience. Investigators and journalists alike emphasized the digital ease of creating identities and how human vulnerability makes those identities powerful. The story that had been private now belonged, in a certain sense, to the public: listeners, commenters, and viewers who debated and dissected every new reveal. After the private investigator's findings and the court filings, a crucial admission occurred, not in a dramatic public confession but in private. The person who had created the Bobby persona eventually acknowledged responsibility and apologized privately to Karat. The civil case ended with a settlement that included financial compensation and an apology letter, a form of remediation that gave Karat an official validation of the harm done. For viewers and readers, however, the apology raised complicated emotions. Was it closure? A legal remedy? A sign of contrition? The answers were as mixed as the public reaction. Some commentators criticized the media coverage of the story, the way it was packaged for podcasts and film. Critics argued that sensationalism risked eclipsing the lived reality of trauma. Others argued that mass platforms provided a stage for desperately needed conversation about online harm, identity theft, and the psychological drivers behind such acts. The debate itself became part of the story's aftermath. One key legal reality remained: In many countries, sophisticated catfishing occupies an awkward place between dishonesty and criminality. The policing of emotional fraud is still evolving. Many viewers left the case with new questions about how law, technology, and empathy intersect and whether law reform was necessary to protect victims of non-physical but devastating deception. What does justice look like after a years-long deception? For Kirat, the settlement provided a kind of legal recognition and an apology. But recovery was slower and textured. The public retelling of her story, first in a podcast and then in a Netflix documentary, turned private pain into a broader conversation about digital safety, the nature of identity, and the cost of being believed. Many survivors of similar scams wrote to Kirat, describing their own attempts to rebuild trust. For the person who orchestrated the deception, the result was invisibility. Public reporting suggests that she retreated from public life, removed social media, and declined to participate in the subsequent documentary. Some stories traced a career that once included a senior role at a firm, other details filled in the portrait of someone who chose an extraordinary path and then withdrew when exposed. The vanisher vanished not into peril, but into anonymity. In the wake of the story, press coverage asked hard questions about narrative framing. Did adapting a painful private saga into entertainment necessarily help the victim, or did it risk sensationalizing the pain? Some media reviews praised the documentary for shedding light on the emotional experience, others faulted it for leaving open key questions about motive and accountability. Still, the coverage ensured the story remained public, a cautionary tale and a prompt for change. This case helped illuminate a number of legal and social questions that our digital age is only just beginning to answer. First, how should laws treat deception that causes psychological injury but not financial theft or physical harm? Second, who bears responsibility for policing identities on platforms designed for instant connection? Third, how should media retellings of trauma balance storytelling with the dignity of survivors? The settlement in the civil suit demonstrated one possible route to accountability, a private remedy where the criminal code did not, or could not, provide one. But settlements do not always set public precedent. They can, however, raise awareness and pressure platforms and policymakers to act. The public conversation post-case included calls for better digital verification, stronger platform accountability, and greater legal clarity about when deception crosses the threshold into prosecutable wrongdoing. Beyond law, there are social changes to consider: digital literacy, public conversations about consent and trust online, and resources for victims of deceptive relationships. Kirat's public testimonial recorded in podcasts and documentaries has become a resource for others who find themselves questioning the authenticity of their own relationships. Vanished is a word we usually reserve for bodies, for abrupt, tangible losses. But sometimes the sudden absence is of a story, a narrative we believed in, a future we planned around, a person who turned out to be a construction of someone else. When that story collapses, the ground underneath a life shifts. Kirat's story is not only about a single deception. It is about how the internet lets us create versions of ourselves and how, when that creative power is used to hurt others, the consequences are devastating. It is a reminder that authenticity matters, and that empathy must be matched by skepticism when the risk is great. If there is hope here, it is that survivors can reclaim their narratives. Kirat did not allow the story to remain private and in darkness. She brought evidence, she pursued justice within the law's limits, and she used public platforms to help others recognize similar patterns. That's the kind of bravery that doesn't always make headlines, but it changes lives. So this Christmas, when the lights shimmer and our phones buzz with messages from people we love, remember the fragile thing trust can be. Remember that absence is often a signal, not just of a person leaving, but of something else changing inside us. And if you're listening and you feel the ache of betrayal, you are not alone. There are people who will listen, resources to help, and a growing public conversation about how to hold digital deception to account.